Graham Nash, who was with the Hollies, and David Crosby of the Byrds, often ran into the Beatles during the Beatles' heyday at the top of their careers when they were just taking the world by storm. Obviously, Graham Nash and even David Crosby looked up to the Beatles and what they were doing. They would often study every song down to every note to understand how they were doing what they were, and the Beatles felt the same way about the Byrds. The feeling was mutual between the Beatles and the Byrds. In August of 1965, the Beatles were in Beverly Hills on a rare day off during another hectic U.S. tour, and Roger McGuinn and Crosby went to the house the Beatles were renting and hung out, partied, and, according to McGuinn, dropped acid together. David, John Lennon, George Harrison, and I took LSD to help get to know each other better, and he said there was a large bathroom in the house, and we were all sitting on the edge of a shower passing around a guitar, taking turns to play our favorite songs. 2 months later, back in London, the Beatles recorded If I Needed Someone. During the sessions for what became the Rubber Soul album, Harrison wrote it and plainly admitted that the song's style was a homage to the emerging Byrds songs, particularly the Bells of Remini. He gave a copy of his new recording to Derek Taylor, the Beatles' former press officer, who flew to Los Angeles and brought it to my house, McGuinn recalled. He said George wanted me to know that he had written the song based on the rising and falling notes of my electric Rickenbacker 12-string guitar introduction. It was a great honor to have it in some small way influenced our heroes, the Beatles. Into that love fest came the Hollies and Graham Nash. Graham Nash's own band evolved into the Hollies 3 years later, and they burned their way up the same UK record charts that the Beatles were dominating by 1965. The Hollies had put 7 consecutive singles into the top 10, including the number 1, I'm Alive, that spring, and they saw Look Through Any Window become their first single to crack the U.S. top 40 that fall. The Hollies planned to continue that upward momentum when it came to record their follow-up. Beatles producer George Martin had given Hollies producer Ron Richards a demo of the as-yet unreleased song If I Needed Someone, and Graham Nash was among those to vote for taking up Harrison's track. They even recorded it in the same EMI studio that the Beatles cut theirs just weeks earlier. Ultimately, both versions were released the same day that December, as a Beatles album track on Rubber Soul and the highly anticipated Hollies' new single. The Hollies cracked the top 20, giving Harrison his first pen chart hit, and George, however, wasn't keen on the Hollies' spin of the song and certainly wasn't shy about sharing that opinion in the music press. The December 10, 1965 issue of New Musical Express showed the state of the pop scene that week. 1 week after the Beatles' track Help was number 3 on the album charts, Rubber Soul was already Britain's best-selling LP, not going to mention that Day Tripper was the best-selling single in the country. The back pages of the issue also included a feature on Xmas Radio with the Hollies and the Hermits. Elsewhere in the magazine, writer Alan Smith was traveling with and documenting the Beatles' tour that winter in support of Rubber Soul. He asked Harrison in particular if he had more songwriting plans in the future since he, as Smith noted, had written If I Needed Someone for the Hollies. "Tell people I didn't write it for the Hollies," George snapped back at Smith. "It's called If I Needed Someone, and they've done it as their new single, but their version is not my kind of music." George wasn't done. He added, "I think it's rubbish the way they've done it. They've spoilt it. The Hollies are all right musically, but the way they do their records, they sound like session men who've just got together in a studio without ever seeing each other. Technically good, yes, but that's all." 1 week later, again in New Musical Express, the headline screamed that Nash and the Hollies blast back at George across the top of the front page. "Not only do these comments disappoint and hurt us, but we are sick and tired of everything the Beatles say or do be taken as law," Graham Nash said. And like George 1 week earlier, he wasn't done. "So the Beatles are the biggest group in the world, and George Harrison and the rest of them are entitled to their own opinions, but when things like this are said, they really must believe their own publicity." Because of Harrison's comments, Graham Nash also said he didn't want the Hollies to release If I Needed Someone as a single in America as a matter of principle. Now, both Graham Nash and David Crosby continued to travel in the Beatles' circle soon after. 1 year after partying with the Byrds in Beverly Hills, the Beatles were back there in August 1966, and they were back hosting a house party with members of the Byrds, including Crosby, who had accompanied them to their Los Angeles press conference to announce the release of the Revolver album. "That's Dave from the Byrds," John quipped about Crosby during the press conference, "a mate of ours. Visiting England 6 months later, Crosby turned up at EMI recording studios on Abbey Road while the Beatles worked on Lovely Rita for the upcoming Sgt. Pepper Lonely Hearts Club Band record. A few months later after that, Graham Nash was at EMI at the request of Paul McCartney. Graham joined friends like Mick Jagger, Keith Richards, and Keith Moon, seated on a floor, gathered guests while the Beatles recorded All You Need Is Love before a worldwide live television audience. Both Graham Nash and David Crosby clearly were on friendly terms with the Beatles, despite Nash's dust-up through the press with George over If I Needed Someone. Crosby and Nash, meanwhile, were on the verge of leaving their respective bands. By 1968, they joined up with Stephen Stills, and the trio immediately sparked a 3-part harmony that was just trying to get off the ground as a new act. I was in Los Angeles with David and Stephen, and Nash recalled, and we went into the studio and recorded 2 songs, You Don't Have to Cry and Helplessly Hoping, and they're pretty stunning. So thrilled about their new sound was Nash that he arranged for the trio of Crosby, Stills, and Nash to audition in London for the Beatles' new Apple Records label, which also happened to be looking for new, fresh talent. We had an apartment on Moscow Road in London, and we were rehearsing the first record, Crosby, Stills, and Nash, in 1969. And we had our shit down, Nash said. To hear Sweet Judy Blue Eyes in our living room was pretty fucking impressive. Graham Nash, along with Crosby and Stills, would find themselves auditioning with Apple's new head of A&R, Peter Asher, and also with Harrison, with whom he had traded barbs about talent and records 3 years earlier. The new trio was full of energy and momentum and came to the session armed with the songs that would eventually comprise their seminal debut album and launch Crosby, Stills, and Nash into superstardom. Except that Harrison and Asher weren't feeling it. The trio got a prompt, polite letter the very next day explaining that signing Crosby, Stills, and Nash to Apple would not be a good fit. "They turned us down," Graham Nash recalled years later. "How could you listen to that first album sung by the 3 of us and go, 'No thanks'? I never understood that." Whatever vibes may have existed between Graham Nash and George Harrison from the If I Needed Someone fuss to the surprisingly failed Apple audition, Nash rarely lets on. Interviews over the decades since regularly feature Graham Nash extolling the Beatles' talent and influence, and Nash has even covered Harrison's signature song, Here Comes the Sun, in concert. But Nash did let his guard down a bit with his 2013 autobiography Wild Tales, A Rock and Roll Life. In those days, tweaking a Beatle was like blaspheming the Pope, he wrote. Every English group owed them a huge debt, but I had no intention of kissing their asses. Besides, last I looked, the Hollies were holding down places on the same top 10 as the Beatles, so pardon me if you don't like our fucking record, but keep it to yourself if you please. Whatever opinions Harrison had on either Nash and the Hollies' take of his song of Nash's audition with Crosby, Stills back then, Nash earned a measure of vindication later when he was enshrined twice in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, once with Crosby, Stills, and Nash, and again with the Hollies. Links between the Hollies and Harrison took an unpredictable personal twist a generation later when the band The New Number 2 surfaced in 2006 and comprised Donnie Harrison, George's son, and Paul Hicks, who is the son of Hollies guitarist Tony Hicks. Paul has also worked on George Harrison's posthumous releases as well.